Welcome to the Here's Waldo podcast, where we sit down with top visionaries and creatives in the video game industry. Together, we'll unravel their journeys and learn more about the path they're forging ahead. Now, let's get started with the show.
I'm Lizzie Mintis, founder and CEO of Here's Waldo Recruiting, a boutique recruitment firm. This is the Here's Waldo podcast. In every episode, we dive deep into conversations with creatives, founders, and executives about what it takes to be successful. You can expect to hear valuable lessons from their journey and get a glimpse into the future of the industry. This episode is brought to you by Here's Waldo Recruiting, a boutique recruitment firm for the game industry. We value quality over quantity, transparency, communication, and diversity. We partner with companies, creatives, and programmers to understand the why behind their needs. We provide a white glove experience that ensures a win-win outcome. Before introducing today's guest, I want to give a big thank you to Wallace Pulcher for introducing us. Thank you. You are such a good connector. Today we have Raph Koster with us. Raph is a veteran game designer and the founder and CEO of Playable Worlds. He's been the lead designer and director of Ultima Online, one of the first MMOs to reach $1 billion, and Star Wars Galaxies. He founded a successful metaverse company called Metaplace, sold it to Disney Playdom, and he is widely respected as one of the greatest social designers of Sandbox Games. His book, called A Theory of Fun for Game Design, is one of the undisputed classics in the games field and was recently revised for a 10th anniversary edition. Thank you so much for being here today. Let's get started. First of all, can you tell us a bit about Playable Worlds and maybe tease a bit about what you're doing?
Sure. I founded Playable Worlds in 2018 along with Eric Goldberg, and really trying to set out to reinvent what can be done with online gaming and with MMOs in particular. Cloud technology has come such a long way. The things that we can do with simulation, with really bringing more living worlds into being than what we've been able to do in the past. It's really a new canvas. It opens up new forms of gameplay. The kinds of dreams that players have had for their virtual worlds for decades now are, can actually be built. Whereas before, it feels like we've been in a mode where the worlds were very static. Players couldn't have a lot of impact. So we're setting out to change that.
You're an inspiring CEO. You're a classic CEO. You're like the perfect big picture vision. I'm excited. What made you decide that you were ready to start another company?
Oh gosh. Post selling the prior company, it sold to Disney, and I worked basically as an internal consultant within Disney, right? Which means you don't get to really work on your own things. And at heart, I'm a product guy, right? I like making things myself. So it was a thing where I was there for a few years. And then after that, I was pretty tired and I ended up doing 6 months off. And then I got pulled into doing consulting, right? And it was fun. I was helping out lots of companies, Activision, Wooga, Google, Facebook, you name it, right? But again, I got the itch to make something for myself. And it's been a while since I had been doing a classic, full-on, massively multiplayer game. There was a period where I did things in mobile, a period where I did things on web games, Facebook games, etc. But it had been a while, and it felt like the market was ripe and the technology was ripe. So a lot of it was about waiting until it was the right kind of business circumstances to be able to do the kind of dream game that I wanted to do.
And so was it your idea or your co-founders? How did your partnership come to be, and how did you decide what you wanted to do exactly?
Oh, yeah, no, that was all me. Eric serves the role of the business person primarily.
Okay.
So no, I put together the high-level game design plan, high-level technical architecture plan, high-level story and lore plan, high-level marketing plan. I put together all of those things before even deciding to actually go found the company, right? It was, uh, it I'm very much sort of a synthesis person who ends up thinking about all those different angles at once. And so I ended up putting all of that together and then approached Eric, and we went from there.
How could Eric say no? You have all the plans all laid out.
Oh no, there's always the questions of, is this something that you can fundraise for? Is this something that there will be, an appetite for in the funding community? That's not the same thing as whether there's an appetite in the player community, right?
Right.
So
What advice do you have for people fundraising? It's such a hot topic right now, and I suppose always, but I feel like a lot of people are trying to crack it. So how do you ensure that what you're creating is fundraisable?
yeah, I would say it boils down to the fact that quite a lot of endeavors within the game industry aren't what are typically classified as venture work, right? The way venture capital math works, they put in a bunch of different investments. And out of their 100 investments, they're hoping that maybe one pays back all of them. So they're very much investing, assuming sort of an exponential curve. Um, it's possible for an individual game to do that, right? Like those exist. There are Minecrafts in the world. There are, or whatever. But it's a lot more common, and this is the way they tend to think, for it to be about more than just a product, right? Like Mitch Lasky likes to talk about it in terms of, is this a feature, is this a product, or is this a company? And I think one of the challenges is that the game industry is biased towards things that are a product, right? Like they're rarely pitching a feature if they go out to raise venture, but they're often not thinking in terms of, how do I pitch this as a company? What is the long-term idea? The reason why this is more than just a single product bet, because that's what then can provide the kinds of returns that VC is looking for. I think that a lot of folks in games are coming from pitching to publishers.
Yeah.
Publishers don't think that way. Publishers have a different kind of mentality. They're not necessarily looking for something like that, of that scale. In fact, it can be a turnoff for them. And so it's probably the commonest thing I see. I get asked to look at pitches for to help out startup companies a lot, and it's the biggest thing. You have to be able to tell a story that is about how you can own or drive a new segment, or you can build a moat around your product because nobody else can do what you can do, and then from there develop it into a new genre, or that you have access to a market nobody else does. It's stories like that, and a lot of game studios don't tend to think that way.
Yeah. Thank you for the perspective. Hiring is always a challenge, and I say this as the owner of a recruiting company. And throughout the years, I feel like you get better. And I'm sure you can look at pitches or you can look at people and you're like, yeah, this is going to work, right? You kind of have the sense after a while. But what do you look for in your early hires, and what kinds of things do you think about when building a team?
Oh gosh. I actually think this is something that's a skill. I don't necessarily claim to be great at it. So maybe you shouldn't ask my advice. What I look for is buy-in to the vision of what we're trying to do. Um, and maybe that's wrong, because after all, startups often need to pivot a lot, and if you're too wedded to that, then that could be a problem. But what I want is that shared enthusiasm, right? I want everybody to be pulling in the same direction. I want there to be constructive conflict where people go, no, 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 you got to go a little to bear right, or whatever, in order to help us get to our destination. So for me, a lot of it is about that. I want people who are flexible thinkers. I want people who are um, ideally people who are good with other people, right?
Yeah.
As a boss, having to manage constant conflicts, it takes away from actually building the thing. Um, yeah, those are probably the biggest things for me.
Very inspired, even when you're I mean, I hire for my own team, right? And it's so funny
Mhm.
because I think, oh, I'd be such an expert, but yeah, just figuring out what questions are right for you and your culture. But I like what you said about enthusiasm. And I feel like passion can't really be taught. I mean, you can be passionate about like you are or you aren't for the most part, right? Just figuring out how you can discern that.
Yeah, I think, I actually avoided using the word passion because sometimes people use the word passion as shorthand for, oh, here's a worker we can exploit. Right.
No, that's true.
But yeah, I think I want people who will care about what we're doing, who
Yeah.
aren't just hired guns. I want them to be emotionally invested in it because better work comes out when people are emotionally invested in what you're trying to accomplish.
And they're able to have their own opinion, like you said, and push back and
Push
contribute
back.
that way if they're into it, if they're just checking in and out. Like, yeah, seems
Yeah,
good.
that's exactly right.
Yeah. You've been in the industry for over 30 years. Tell me about how you broke into the video game industry.
Oh, not that it's a useful story for anybody breaking in today, right? It was so different back then. So I was in graduate school, getting a degree in a fine arts degree in poetry, actually. And at the same time, I was working on and playing a lot of text based online games because that's what was around in the early 1990s. Um, and one of the programmers that I worked on games with was hired to do a pilot project at Origin, which was at the time a famed studio owned by EA in Austin. And he recommended me and my wife for positions in this skunk work project that was just getting started. He and I had actually shared, I guess, my first video game credit before that, which was a shareware game that was published by Marafware back when you would buy a CD-ROM with 100 mahjong and board games on it. And we had done a game for one of those together. So that was actually my entry point. It was a classic case of being prepared and then getting lucky because I was prepared. The pilot project was for one of the first big, massively multiplayer games, and the studio was looking for people who had expertise in online worlds. And the place to go find those people was in these text based games. So I was prepared, but I got really lucky that my friend happened to, land that gig and then recommended me in. And he landed that gig through luck because they had gone to him for a different thing altogether. And casually in conversation, he mentioned, hey, so yeah, this is actually the kind of thing I enjoy making. And they said, oh, we have a pilot project for that. So yeah, it was very much a luck favors the prepared, but also the who you know. And, it wasn't a connection that had a lot of power. It was a connection that was coming in as a newbie, just like me.
I think a lot of people's stories are about knowing somebody and yeah, you're in the right place in the right time, but you also seize the opportunity and you're doing something you're passionate and you're putting yourself out there a little bit. So I think that those things still land true today. I mean, if you apply to a bunch of jobs, you might not get it, but if someone can recommend you and you're passionate about the product, you're a lot more likely to.
You're a lot more likely to. It's still who you know still matters a lot, and networking and still matters a lot. But the scale of it is so different because back then, what ended up happening was the expertise that we had built working on these text muds, the text based games, was relatively rare. And we'd actually built it to a notable degree. Like we were working on a very respected one of those games, a game that people pointed at and said, wow, that game's really impressive. Right. So we were really well prepared. But even then, like I ended up being leading the design of that game when I was 25, and it was a giant project. I think that probably wouldn't happen today. I think that's pretty unlikely.
Yeah.
So yeah, but it was just a smaller industry. you know.
It's grown a lot. It's still growing. Even with all the layoffs, it's still enormous.
Yeah. Yeah. This is, I guess it is technically the first contraction year the games have had since probably what, the Atari crash, maybe.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
yeah, the trend lines remain pointing up.
I know. I think that's so important for people to remember.
Yeah.
Things flip back. And now's a great time for new studios and just time for innovation and trying things you wouldn't. Like a lot of people are more risk averse right now, right? A lot of the bigger players. So if you're riskier and smaller, maybe like your studio.
Yeah, I think that the challenge there right now is actually that money to get going is pretty hard to come by. So I think if you are in a position where you can get going without needing a lot of capital,
Yeah.
now is a really good time to go try doing something. If you need capital, I think it's a little bit challenging right now.
Yeah, very true. A16Z has speedrun. I mean, there are different ways now that you can get in, but yeah, to actually fundraise is everyone's biggest problem.
Yeah, it's a bit of a challenging environment at the moment. I think it's a little easier actually down at the when if you're really small down at the seed level. I think it's more available there.
Yes,
Yeah.
definitely. But there are a lot of studios starting right now, and I'm optimistic.
Yeah, just got asked actually. Edge magazine did a big anniversary article. I guess it was I forget what it was, but a big anniversary, and they asked a bunch of developers, "What's your 10-year forecast?" Right, and I actually, I gave what people are portraying as as a grim or dark view of the future, and I guess it's sort of a matter of opinion. The things that I pointed out were that game dev costs are continuing to rise, even for indies, right? Even indies are. The stats on whether or not you can build a successful indie studio have never been great, right? It is a little bit of you've got to get lucky and you've got to make a great game. But there are more games out there now that are good than ever before. It's a golden age for games. That means competition is also pretty stiff, right? And we're seeing budgets at the high end continue to push into just astronomical territory. So it's sort of an interesting time because the compensation for that developers and publishers are doing is moving more into the service games and that kind of thing. But those are hard to put together and they're expensive and it's a big cultural sort of adjustment. And it'll be interesting to see. I worry that that means that other kinds of game genres that don't give that kind of ongoing revenue might might suffer because they won't get as much investment. Everybody will always say, well, we should be doing a service game instead of a consumable game because for the same amount of dollars we have a higher return, right? And I like the linear narrative games. I don't want them to suffer or go away. So yeah, it's an interesting time. I think AI is going to be a really interesting factor because I think a lot of studios are probably going to be driven to adopt it just for cost reasons, regardless of how they feel about it sort of ethically.
I would agree. I think more and more people are looking at cheaper places because it's expensive in America, but it's not as expensive in other locations. And I know just from a development standpoint, there are a lot of tax credits, places like Montreal, or you could go somewhere far, far cheaper. So I think the places that games come from will shift a little bit too. Like who has been traditional. I mean, obviously there's the big players, right? And they're not going to go away, but maybe other places will start to develop more and the dynamic will change.
Yeah, I think we've been seeing that, right? In gradual slow motion over the last even 20 years. Um, certainly the idea that outsourcing is a major way to do things has been rising. If you look at some of the larger projects that are out there, whether it's a Fortnite game or an Ubisoft game or whatever, those make huge extensive use of outsourcing, and a lot of that outsourcing is, whether it be Asian studios or Eastern Europe or whatever. It's definitely kind of become sort of an assumed mode once you get above a certain scale of development.
The amount of people that work on a title is crazy too.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, just random stats I've heard. I've heard Fortnite's team is like well over 1,000. I hear that Baldur's Gate 3, I think, was 450 people, right? There are rumors out there of AAA major franchises with budgets that are at $750 million. So yeah, those are big numbers. And of course, as a creative, big numbers often means less creativity, right? So I spend a lot of time playing indie games where you can find a lot more of the experimental stuff. But I also want the indies to be able to eat, right? I want them to be able to make back their money. So the rising costs being even down at that end is a worrisome trend to my mind.
Yeah, absolutely. Tell me more about your Ultima Online days. And I'm sure you get asked this a lot, but tell me about launching the game and the
Oh gosh.
how you overcame them.
Yeah, Ultima Online was an experiment. It was a skunkworks project back then. Origin had wanted to do an online version of Ultima for a long time. I don't. Yeah, I imagine plenty of your listeners may be too young to remember the heyday of the Ultima series, but it was the Final Fantasy of its day. It was one of the premier role-playing game brands and franchises that existed. It was hugely influential. Some of the things that we take for granted today in role playing games that came from Ultima and from the kinds of things that it provided. Um, some of the earliest versions of crafting, party based gameplay, the notions of things like NPC schedules and day night schedules and all of that. The first morality systems in video games. A lot of these things were pioneered by the Ultima series. So it was a name to conjure with, right? It was a big deal to take Ultima into this brand new realm of building an internet game around it. And the internet itself was also kind of a new idea to most people. You know, uh, Pictures on the internet didn't even really come along until 94. And early 95, late 94, early 95 is when Origin started working on this idea. So it was a brand new kind of thing, and Origin was not the only people who jumped in feet first to try to take the old text-based MUDs and make graphical versions of them. There were other titles, Meridian 59, The Realm, and so on. But what that meant was that Origin had no clue how to build a game like that, right? It was completely new to them. It was new to virtually everybody in games. There was a segment of online game developers, but it was nowhere near the mainstream. So there was an awful lot to discover. We had so many things that we had to invent. Um, we were put in on a separate floor in kind of a little separate area where the rest of the floor was occupied by, like, I forget what it was, an ad agency or an architecture firm or something like that. uh, Real estate, I don't know, something completely not games that we ignored. And so we would surface in their lobby, come out of the elevator, immediately bear right, and go into our little hallway and closet area down in the corner. And I say hallway and closet, I mean literally. My wife and I worked in a supply closet. The artist sat in the hallway, cramming 3 4 engineers into a room on folding tables. It was very much a skunkworks project. They even then, the ad agency or whatever, moved out, and they demoed that floor, and we had the only part of that floor that was still standing. The rest of the floor was completely empty. and they'd knocked out all of the drywall, all of the glass in the windows. You could walk off the building to your death. And we would surface onto this bare concrete and then, head over to the one enclosed area, and it was winter, and we were typing with fingerless gloves, actually, in order to develop the game, because our server machine sat directly under the thermostat and it was always overheated. So the air conditioning was blowing in the middle of winter and we were all freezing. It was really a great team bonding experience, but also like, wow, okay, this really was sort of a skunkworks project. And we built the earliest versions of the game and just posted up a web page, which was a brand new idea, right? Posting up a web page for a game, and we put up an FAQ. And I'm told it was the first web page Electronic Arts ever had.
Wow.
And we didn't tell marketing we were doing it, so they didn't know. And we had been given a, sort of a budget that was, they were forecasting we would sell 30,000 copies lifetime ever. And we'd been given like this little starter budget of 150 or $250,000. We got this alpha test up and running, and we couldn't afford to send CDs out for anybody to test the game with. So we posted up on the website and on Usenet and on forums and whatnot saying, hey, so we've got this game, send us $5, we can send you a CD and you can try it out. And we paid back the pilot project money just off of the alpha. And that's when EA realized, oh, this is going to be big. And sure enough, it was. It ended up being really big. So yeah, very much an experiment that turned into a home run swing, I guess is how I'd put it.
Okay, so EA realized it's going to be big. People like your product, and then walk me through launching it. And there's always so many ups and downs, and how you.
Yeah. I mean, it was, for the time, it was an enormous and very ambitious game. It still looks ambitious if you look at descriptions of it. And we crunched like crazy. And I mean, 12, 14-hour days, including weekends.
I'm imagining you in your fingerless gloves, really
Yeah.
cold, typing away, sleeping under your desk.
I did sleep under my desk. They did move us downstairs after a while. And they actually put the mainline Ultima game that was in development, Ultima 9, they put that on hold and assigned over that entire team to us,
Wow.
which that team hated because they didn't know online games. They wanted to be making their game, not ours. So it was politically very uncomfortable. There'd be screaming matches in the hallway sometimes over, it was just a culture mismatch there. The crunch was horrendous, that kind of schedule for a year on end or whatever. And we managed to build that game in just a bit over 2 years, which was, from when the team got fully assembled. There was pilot time before that, right? But it was just a brutal, brutal amount of crunch. The kind that today would be, headlines. Yeah,
For
scandal.
sure.
Yeah, but we managed to get the game out despite having to invent a lot of stuff, like game time cards. Like that idea that you could go to a store and buy a game code and use it to add subscription time or whatever. That was like a weird idea, and we had to generate the codes for the cards. We needed to generate random numbers for it, and so our exec producer literally generated them by wiggling his mouse on the desk for hours. Right? Like there's so many stories like that. It was the first game to do large scale VPN deployment worldwide. The first game to do this is kind of technical, but having a map big enough that multiple servers were managing it and you could move across different machines in a cluster, because it was one of the largest video game worlds that had ever been made. It was the first major mainstream game to give you character customization, pets, player housing, crafting, just a whole host of things that we were inventing, fishing, you name it. Um, all in the goal of making a simulated online world. And the ideas went on to have huge ripple effects. But the game comes out and it's super buggy. And so much so that there was even a class action lawsuit against us because the box said, this is an online game. You can play it 24/7. And some opportunists basically said, but it's laggy, so it's not real time, and it has server downtime for maintenance, so it's not 24/7. And there was actually a class action lawsuit over that.
Well,
So yeah, it it really pioneered on a whole bunch of different angles, I guess is how I'd put it.
how did you figure out how to attract new players after you had so many people who'd been playing for such a long time?
Well, it was actually the fastest selling EA game uh, to that point, because the hype for it was really, really high, and nothing else like it had been seen. Right? There were other games. There were even other graphical MMOs that had come out, Meridian 59, The Realm, and so on. But Ultima Online had the power of the brand. It had the higher, way higher production values, and it was just also just a much more ambitious title. So there was just hype and excitement around, wow, we're getting to play something that hasn't really been seen. There's an interview out there with David Bowie is going, have you heard of this thing, Ultimate Online or whatever? There's Robin Williams was a player, there and so on, right? Like it was a little bit of a cultural moment. There were think pieces in Wired and the New Yorker, right? Like the New Yorker sent a reporter to come look at, hey, they're trying to build an online society. So it was, yeah, it was a bit of a watershed moment. Um, yeah, attracting players was not the problem. Keeping them.
Okay.
We allowed players in the game to kill each other because we basically wanted to build an entire simulated world. And so we had all of those kinds of things. And we were hoping players would form governments, form police forces, do all of that kind of stuff. And it turns out it's way harder to build civilization than it seems. Not too long after launch, we had a population larger than San Antonio. We had an exchange rate to the US dollar better than the Italian lira, and we had a Lord of the Flies murder rate that was through the roof. Right, within the game, like the worst offender was personally responsible for killing over 3,000 other players, many of
Wow.
whom quit. Right, and so the challenge very quickly became about, how do we manage this? And it, it was new. It was the first time that any game had hit scales like that ever. And so it was just enormously difficult. We found ourselves, we had been trying to think like game designers, and suddenly we had to start thinking like a government. We had to start thinking and inventing things like, wow, we need new forms of customer service policies. We need new we need ethical codes of conduct for our game masters. Because early on, there were serious challenges with um, misbehaviors, and game masters doing things like trading in-game benefits for real-world things like money or favors. So we all of this stuff, and it was just this overwhelming new challenge. And it took quite a while, right? Today, there's a whole host of sort of SOP, standard operating practices that are in place because of the lessons from Ultima Online.
How do you think? I know there's so many SOPs today, but how can people think today, especially with AI and all these new technologies, about building effective communities that keep players engaged?
Yeah, a lot of these are actually quite difficult to learn for studios that aren't coming from a service game background, right? Like I often say, it takes 5 to 7 years to really wrap your head around what it means to be in a service as opposed to a packaged good kind of mode. In order to build strong communities, first you need the players to actually have dependence on one another, which runs contrary to a different desire, which is making your game accessible and easy to get into. Those two things are somewhat contradictory, and you have to learn to strike a balance. The primary predictors of people sticking with your game are actually the friends they make. That's the number one predictor. The level of investment they have into things in the game that they can't take with them is another. And one of the weird lessons, for example, is these are role playing games. Often players develop a persona. People pick up the persona and take it to another game very easily. That's easy. That happens all the time. Um, so you have to find other things that they can invest into in the game, whether it's decorating their house or whatever it is. Even guilds, very common to see entire guilds pick up and leave together, right? So yeah, you're in the business of building friendships, but friendships migrate out of the game if you're successful, and then you lose them out of your game. um, you need to think about building that kind of community interdependence pretty carefully. This is, character classes and different ways to play and all of that kind of thing. Um, you need to think about how you as an operator relate to that community. Because if you are too distant from them, they lose trust in you, right? You need to be human for them to have trust. And, this is the same issue as in the real world, right? Like nobody trusts the politicians in Washington, but maybe you trust people that you know, right? It's
Yep.
very hard to trust people at a distance, remote, faceless, et cetera. Um, so finding ways to earn that trust, and a lot of that is about um, consistency, whether it's consistency of updates, but also when people misbehave, do you have clear policies? Can people rely on the fact that you're not going to be arbitrary and capricious, right? Um, Keeping your promises, which one of the ways people do that today is by not making the promises, right? The
Yeah.
less you promise, the easier it is to keep them. There's just a whole host of these things that you end up needing to think about a lot, and it really does change how you design the games. Um, your instinct would be, if you come from packaged goods, it might very well be, oh, well, we need a handheld narrative all the way through, and we need to control the player's experience, and we need them to be able to play entirely on their own. So, because coordination with other people is a huge pain, right? Like, and, all of those instincts are wrong. Every single one of them is backwards in one way or another. If you're trying to build a really long lasting service game.
Who do you think is doing it really well right now?
Oh gosh, League of Legends, Warframe, Fortnite, um, and these are all groups like, especially Epic. The story of Fortnite is of a studio that's gradually shifted over time, right? More and more and more into this mode. And in their case, I think they started that shift early when they moved from making the regular Unreal games and went into Unreal Tournament. And when Gears of War developed into more of a co-op online play game franchise, right? Those are things that help them make the turn towards running something like Fortnite. Um, it's a lot of it is about making that turn. Final Fantasy is another brand that has made that turn successful. Um, then you have ones like Rockstar with Grand Theft Auto, where it feels like the audience made that turn for them, right? Grand Theft Auto started out, I mean, even the last Grand Theft Auto, right? Online was not the point, but the players love inhabiting that world so much that they are the ones who have effectively driven Grand Theft Auto Online almost more than the developer has.
And so many people are building games with their community now, which is really interesting.
Yeah, that actually was something that we were doing a lot of, even in the 90s, right? Like in the 90s, in the heyday of the early shooters, people like John Carmack and John Romero and Tim Sweeney were posting up what were called plan files, which were sort of their developer diaries, and they were sharing what they were doing every day. On Ultima Online, we were very open with the community. Here's the features that we're working on. Here's the things that we're going to do. I think big budget marketing works against doing that because you want to save up all of your cool
Yeah.
features for a big announcement. That means doing a big dollar splash and so on. But the grassroots way of doing it, of essentially co-building with a community really, really helps if you're one of the smaller shops, right? If you're not planning on doing a giant marketing drop. So yeah, I mean, I'm a huge fan of it. We have been fairly stealthy with Playable Worlds, and just sort of dribbling out little bits of info on our Discord and that kind of thing. Um, but I'm looking forward to the moment when we announce, and then we can really do a lot more of that collaborating with the player base on, hey, let's make sure this is a game that you all want, right? Um, in our case, we've been building for a while. We've been building fundamental technology. We're past that now. We're well into building game proper. Um, but yeah, it's getting to be time to start telling them what we're doing.
Any idea of when that time will come, or you cannot say?
Oh no, not quite yet, right? I think
I'm just
one of the yeah,
kidding.
one of the things about the connected world we live in now is that anything you say can immediately fly around the world, right? And I think a big thing is an awful lot of folks are driven by kind of first marketing impressions. So we need to make sure that we have a great video to show before we put something up. And that means we still got to tune up graphics and things like that. Because yeah, first impressions can be pretty powerful.
True. I want to hear more about founding Metaplace and how you came up with that idea and what it evolved into.
Sure. So I did Metaplace at the time. I was chief creative officer at Sony Online, and um, for a variety of reasons, I was attending a lot of what back then was the Web 2.0 kind of thing. Attending a lot of those conferences. It was a moment when everybody was talking about participatory internet, user generated content, people setting up blogs. It was the heyday of blogs, and WordPress was just really starting to blossom. And um, Second Life was out there. It was a period where, hey, users build the web. It's not broadcast. That was kind of the main idea. Broadcast won out over the long haul, and all of that user generated stuff got corralled into, you know, the Facebooks and Twitter/X's of the world, right? But back then, it seemed like 1,000 flowers were blooming. And there were a bunch of game projects at the time that were pursuing that. And with a Sony, I had been trying to get Sony interested in those, and they wouldn't nibble. And I really believed that web-based gaming was going to be a really big thing and was going to change the industry. And so uh, for a variety of reasons, I ended up leaving Sony. And because I'd been going to all of these events, I was plugged into some of the venture capital world and ended up founding Metaplace to pursue that vision of what games could be. And the goal was, let's build a platform for online worlds that works like the web does, that lets you have a thin client so you can use one client to connect to lots of different worlds, that you can develop the games entirely in the cloud. And that means your one client can connect to many different kinds of games because everything comes down on the fly. And then give that to users so that they could start doing the equivalent of blogs, but with little worlds. and have them all connect into a big old metaverse network. And if that sounds like Roblox to you, you're not wrong. That was what we were doing. We were basically doing that starting in 2006, which is also when Roblox started, as well as a bunch of others that you've never heard of. It was in the air. So we built that. We succeeded at building that platform, and it worked. There were worlds that you could log into built by users that connected to educational software like Moodle, and you could run your college class in it and do your exams in it and everything. There were worlds that connected to Amazon, and you could run a full virtual storefront and walk around in it. There were worlds that could slurp Shakespeare plays off the internet in XML form, spawn the cast of characters, costume them, and present the play in real time on a virtual old globe stage, right? All of that stuff. And it was all built by players, by users. And it was awesome. And we were not making money. Arguably, we were just too early, right? There still isn't a platform out there that does all of those things. And Roblox ended up succeeding. They had much deeper pockets than we did, but it took them 10 years to get to the point where there was really good user generated content on the platform, enough so that players who just wanted to play could find something entertaining. And we ran out of money before we were able to do that. So we had to pivot the company to just making games. Here we had this amazing engine, and we started making Facebook farming games with it. But that meant we were able to make amazing Facebook farming games with it. Stuff that was fully multiplayer. When you visited each other's farms, you could chat, you could do things together, you could have pet animals like pet dogs and whatnot, and all kinds of things. The visual bar was way higher than what the likes of Farmville was doing. And the result was that we were able to ship a couple of hit Facebook games in like one a month.
Wow.
And so we went from struggling company that was 48 hours from insolvency to making more money on the first day of opening the game that we had in the previous 4 years.
Wow.
And it was a complete turnaround. And so we went from that to a 3-war bidding war to buy us. And so we made that pivot, and literally we were getting approached for a sale in less than 4 months. And we ended up being part of Playdom acquiring us as part of their roll-up strategy. And Playdom was in the process of being acquired by Disney. So I went through 2 acquisitions in 30 days.
Wow.
Which was pretty crazy. Kind of a wild time. And we ended up with the technology moving into Disney Core Tech. It ended up getting used for a couple of dozen games. And the most notable of those is that Club Penguin was ported over to the Metaplace technology. And that enabled them to put Club Penguin on tablets, on iPad. And it instantly, 50% of the user base moved over to mobile. So yeah, it was a wild ride, and it's sort of weird. Like from a career point of view, it was the most financially rewarding personal to
Sure.
me personally, even though to my mind the product failed. Right? Like it goes to show you never know. Whereas many of the other games had a much larger, you know, like Ultima Online made way more money in the end, but I didn't get any of it. Right?
You had
So yeah,
emotional value from that.
yeah, exactly. So you just never know. I think it's Metaplace is a little bit forgotten now, but in practice, like there's a wonderful article written by a fellow at Microsoft Research who works in metaverse tech. And he just bluntly said in one of his articles, this is the closest thing we ever got. This is the closest thing the world has ever seen to an actual metaverse. And it ran live from 2007 to New Year's Day 2010. That's it.
I want to know, I have so many questions for you. I want to know more about this pivot. Like that's such a, I'm stressed listening to you. Like you have 2 days left, or you're days away from shutting down your company, right? How did you decide to make this pivot and get everyone on board and get it going? Even though it was so clearly not what you were most passionate about, but it was what
Oh,
you did, right?
lack of choices clarifies your thinking, right? We were very close to running out of money. We had really significant division among the company leaders. Okay, like it was screaming matches in rooms because we're hitting crisis points,
Yeah.
and it was very hard to see a path forward. One of those execs was had been arguing for, hey, we can get a bridge money and recap the company. I was playing an angle of, hey, that we had a purchase offer on the table that would have come through prior to us hitting it. And so I was trying to play that one out as far as I could before we had to make the call. And yeah, that then we ran math and discovered, oh crap, our liabilities, if we want to treat our employees fairly, mean
Well,
that we actually have quite a bit less runway than we really thought. And so it really came right up to the very last moment. Is this acquisition deal going to happen? And I vividly remember it was with a really large Asian company, and everybody on the US side had already signed off. And it was going up to one decision maker on the other side of the Pacific. And they said, yeah, we don't understand web gaming and we're not going to do it. And the very next morning, brought everybody together and we cut the company in half. And we pivoted immediately to the bridge strategy. And the other part of doing the bridge strategy was actually me falling on my sword and saying, if we are pivoting in this way, I am not the right CEO to do it. And so, as part of that, I stayed as chairman of the board, but I actually handed over the CEO role to somebody else because it was the way to execute the pivot. And, that was pretty challenging. That was hard. And then we had a very limited time, and actually, to my mind, we treated our existing customers not very well. It was the first big argument I had with the new CEO was he's like, we've got to make a clean break. So we're giving them 2 weeks over the Christmas holidays to download all of their user generated content. And we got pretty badly beaten up in the press. And I agreed with the press on that. But because I was the face of the company, I couldn't say that.
yeah.
And that was pretty painful too, because I was the one getting beat up over, oh, you talk a big game and now look what you did, right? Happens, right? And then we turned around and tried to double down and focus on building a game. And we shipped one in about 3 weeks. And boom, it was a hit instantly.
Wow. And I just listened to this panel the other day of 4 people who had sold their company and one who almost did. And they were just talking about what they wish they knew. And I'm not sure what you can say, but I mean, merger and acquisition is such a stressful time. You're giving away your baby to somebody else to run with it, right? And
Yeah, but
it's an emotional thing.
it is emotional. But the interesting, like in one way, it was a little less emotional because the baby I was selling was the changeling baby, not
Yeah.
the one I did originally. You know what I mean?
It was the odd
Yeah,
twin.
yeah, exactly. And so, in that sense, it was a little bit minimized, but there was absolutely this feeling of once I was there within Playdom and within Disney, it didn't take very long before, oh, well, it isn't your game team anymore.
Yeah.
But you still are in charge of the tech side. And then, oh, well, your next assignment is to transition the tech away and give it to people inside Disney. And pretty soon, it was like after about a year and a half, I was a vice president at Disney, and I had no reports because I had transitioned all of them off, and I was a VP without portfolio. And that's when I was like, why am I here?
Uh, yeah, that's like a classic story of selling your company.
Yep, exactly.
Uh, I have one final question before I ask it. I just want to point people to your website at playableworlds.com. My last question is, what do you think makes a game so fun to play? And what can people do to make their game fun to play?
Oh, well, I wrote a whole book about that.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. I think what it comes down to is people play games for all kinds of different reasons, right? Sometimes people play them for comfort, they play them for meditation, they play them because their friends are playing them and they want to hang out with a friend, all of those kinds of things. But the bottom line, if you're thinking about what makes a game fun to play, it's because it's presenting us with problems to solve. And so the trick to making a game fun is it's got to have good problems for a particular player. Every player will have different kinds of problems they enjoy solving. So, good problems that fit the player, problems they can see their way to figuring out. If they look at the problem, they go, I have no idea. Then they'll say the game's too hard and they'll bail. If they look at the problem and they go, well, that's easy, they also won't have fun. It's got to be at the right challenge level, right? Because the thing that keeps a person in that sensation of fun is the feeling that they are learning as they go. They're figuring out new steps, figuring out new strategies, new approaches, new tactics, and kind of pushing at the edge of what they know how to pull off. That's what that's what gives us that sensation of fun. That's why no game can be for everybody because everybody comes to the game with different skills and different knowledge levels and preferences. Um, but if you think about it that way, it means that there are certain things you can do for any sort of game to kind of maximize the fun. You need to make sure to give them a path in. You need to make sure that they get rewarded when they are figuring out steps along the way, right? You need to make sure that they can build on what they've learned previously, right? And a lot of things flunk this, right? It can be through bad UX. It can be flunking it from the other angle. Like gambling has amazing UX usually, but the player is not actually learning anything, and so it's actually hollow after a while, right? Um, yeah. So it's really at the heart of that. If you can ask yourself at every moment, can I keep the player learning something? Can I keep them figuring out something new? That's the trick to giving them lasting.
Thank you for your wisdom and the quick cliff notes of your book.
Sure. My
We've
pleasure.
been talking to Raph Koster, who's CEO of Playable Worlds. Raph, where can people go to learn more about you, read your book, work for you, contact you?
Sure. To get in touch with me, the easiest path is actually raphkoster.com. I've been running that blog since sometime in the early 1990s. And all of my talks and books and games and everything are all linked there. There's decades worth of accumulated design writing there. There are a couple of books out, Theory of Fun, of course. There's another one called Postmortems, which is histories of the various games I've made and how we built them and then what happened to them. So if you are a developer and you want to really dig in on that side, there's that 700 plus pages. Of that. If you want to know more about Playable Worlds, we have a series of blog posts on playableworlds.com as well. Job postings and all of that are there. And there is a Discord where we hang out with our prospective players and chat about the game that we're making. So all of those are good places to go.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for listening to the show this week. To catch all the latest from Here's Waldo, you can follow us on LinkedIn. Be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes. We'll see you next time.